Joe Biden is now saying true things about the risk of nuclear war with Russia. The problem is he has no strategy to deal with it. And when he says these true things publicly, all he does is increase the incentive for Vladimir Putin to threaten the use of nuclear weapons. See, here's the thing about being president. It's a different job than what I do for a living. What I do for a living is I explain to people how politics works. I try to give a bird's eye view of what is going on a daily basis from a conservative perspective. What Joe Biden does is governance, and governance requires that you actually have an eye on policy. You have an eye on what exactly you are going to do. It requires you to, on domestic policy, negotiate sometimes where people like me are speaking to principle. And on foreign policy, it requires you to actually strategically think about the words that are coming out of your face hole. When you are Joe Biden, however, you apparently don't think about this. And this is why it's a real problem what he said to a bunch of donors, even though I agree with much of what he said to the donors. There are certain things you don't say out loud in public if you're the president of the United States, because you are skewing the incentive structure for your enemies. And this is a perfect example of that. So here's what Joe Biden said, according to the Associated Press. He said on Thursday that the risk of nuclear Armageddon is at the highest level since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, as Russian officials speak of the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons after suffering massive setbacks in the 8-month invasion of Ukraine. Speaking at a fundraiser for the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, Biden said that Putin was, quote, a guy I know fairly well, and that the Russian leader was not joking when he talks about the use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological or chemical weapons. He added, quote, we have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He suggested the threat from Putin is real because his military is, you might say, significantly underperforming. Now, you've heard me say the same thing. I actually agree with every word of that. The thing is, I'm not the president of the United States who is currently pursuing an extraordinarily strenuous war with the Russians, including the use of American materiel and funding. Here's the problem. If you're the president of the United States and you are pursuing a strategy that basically says Ukraine wins, Russia loses, this means one of two things has to happen. One, you think that Vladimir Putin is bluffing. You think that when he's talking about the use of biological, nuclear, chemical weapons, that he's lying, that that isn't true. And the reason that that isn't true is because he is so fearful of the United States' response or NATO's response that he's just not going to do it. And so we are going to call his bluff, and we are going to essentially do the militaristic thing, right? And we're just going to continue along our merry way, funding the Ukrainians in this war, even if they are pushing into the Donbass region, even if they are not pushing into Crimea, even if they've already pushed beyond the borders of this war from when the war first began, right? If they're pushing back on the 2014 territorial gains made by the Russians. Okay, so that is possibility number one, is you think Putin's bluffing. But Biden just took that off the table, right? He says he doesn't think that Putin is bluffing, which means that you better damn well have a strategic deterrent available in order to dissuade Vladimir Putin from using nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons. And this is the part that Biden doesn't actually talk about. He doesn't actually say what it is that we will do to deter Vladimir Putin from using his nuclear weapons, because we obviously take the threat seriously. So that means that we must have some sort of response that is dissuading Vladimir Putin from using his nuclear weapons. And Biden apparently said nothing about that, which means that, effectively speaking, Putin now knows Biden's mind, and he knows that he's got Biden over a barrel. Because if Biden has no strategic response to the possibility of use of nuclear weapons, then that means that there's going to have to be an off-ramp. And it means that Putin actually has the whip hand in seeking the off-ramp. See, if you're seeking a credible off-ramp here, what you'd really want to do is say to Russia, listen, we don't fear you. Your best opportunity to get something out of this deal is to take the off-ramp. But if what you're saying to Vladimir Putin is, we do fear you, we fear you're going to use nuclear weapons, and we have no good strategic response to dissuade you from doing so, who then has the upper hand? Vladimir Putin has the upper hand in those negotiations. By the way, the evidence that Vladimir Putin has the upper hand in the negotiations actually comes courtesy of the North Koreans. Okay, there's a reason why North Korea is suddenly increasing its missile tests. And you may not have noticed it because there's so much going on in the news, but according to The Guardian, millions of residents of northern Japan will have felt a sense of deja vu on Tuesday morning when they were alerted to a North Korean missile flying overhead. 5 years earlier, they had twice been shaken from their slumber by Japanese government warnings to seek shelter after missile launches by Pyongyang. The intermediate range missile involved in this week's test was far from buzzing the rooftops of Hokkaido farmhouses. It flew at an altitude of 1,000 kilometers as it made its way to the Pacific Ocean, where it splashed down without incident, about 3,000 kilometers east of Japan. But it caused a lot of anxiety among residents. North Korea has been ramping up dramatically its use of missile technology, trying to freak the West out, because this is what North Korea does. Basically, North Korea constantly participates in nuclear rent-seeking. They threaten the use of nuclear weapons. They threaten the use of missiles. And then they hope that somebody hands them money. They basically engage in blackmail against the West. And they tend to ramp that up when they believe that the West is fearful, when they believe that the West is vulnerable. And this happens to be that particular time. According to the UK Guardian, in strategic terms, Pyongyang's more assertive behavior is a consequence of global political instability that has given it an opportunity to provoke its neighbors without fear of inviting another round of sanctions. The war in Ukraine has not only become a distraction for Joe Biden, it has opened the door to closer ties between Pyongyang and Moscow, while recent Chinese military activity in the Taiwan Strait has enabled the North to exploit rising tensions between Washington and Beijing. North Korea is a case in point, like a perfect case in point of, if you get one nuke, you can remain in power literally forever. That's how strong the nuclear deterrent is. And so the North Koreans are currently looking at how the West is treating Vladimir Putin, taking his threats incredibly seriously, as they should, but without any real sort of strategic attempt at deterrence. And they're thinking, we can do whatever we want. We can now blackmail the West in the same way that Vladimir Putin is blackmailing the West. According to The Guardian, the heady days of unity on display in 2017, when the UN Security Council, including Russia and China, imposed heavy sanctions on the North, are over. Disunity means more serious provocations lie on the horizon as the North continues to exploit Ukraine, Taiwan, and a hamstrung Security Council to push its status as a legitimate nuclear state. So again, the evidence that people do not fear the United States and do not fear the West if they have a nuclear weapon, which is why Iran is desperately seeking a nuclear weapon right now. A nuke means that you can now hold the West hostage. It's because of language like the language that Joe Biden is using. When he says that we are very close to nuclear Armageddon, and then he is not making clear what he would do if a tactical nuclear weapon were used in Ukraine to dissuade Vladimir Putin from doing that. Like, a credible deterrent relies on the naked display of possibility of power. That is what happens here. And the great lie of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis is that it ended because JFK was strong. The truth is it ended because JFK made a bunch of concessions about use of American missiles and the American missile shield in places like Turkey. There's an actual trade of Jupiter missiles in Turkey for the missiles that were being put in Cuba. Hey, but the bottom line here is this. Biden has now limited his options because he said this stuff publicly. According to the Associated Press, U.S. officials for months have warned of the prospect that Russia could use weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine as it has faced a series of strategic setbacks on the battlefield, though Biden's remarks marked the starkest warnings yet issued by the U.S. government about the nuclear stakes. It was not immediately clear whether Biden was referring to any new assessment of Russian intentions. As recently as this week, U.S. officials said they have seen no change to Russia's nuclear forces that require a change in the alert posture of U.S. nuclear forces. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said on Tuesday, quote, "We've not seen any reason to adjust our own strategic nuclear posture, nor do we have indication that Russia is preparing to imminently use nuclear weapons." So again, Joe Biden is saying what his administration is not, right? His administration is saying, we're not seeing any sea change here. We think that it's quite possible that a bluff is happening. But meanwhile, you have Joe Biden out there saying it's not a bluff. Biden challenged the Russian nuclear doctrine, warning that the use of lower-yield tactical weapons could quickly spiral out of control into global destruction. He said, "I don't think there's any such thing as the ability to easily use a tactical nuclear weapon and not end up with Armageddon." He added he was still trying to figure out an off-ramp for Putin in Ukraine. He says, where does he find a way out? Where does he find himself in a position that does not only lose face, but lose significant power within Russia? And again, the question really is one for the United States to pose. Like, what off-ramp are you offering to Vladimir Putin if you're doing this? What you really need to do is offer both a carrot and a stick. So if you are going to take the Russian threat seriously, then you have to say, on the one hand, what David Petraeus said, right, the former commander of CENTCOM. You're going to have to say to Vladimir Putin, if you use a tactical nuclear weapon, we are going to sink every ship in the Baltic. We are going to take out all strategic Russian forces in the Ukrainian region, all of them, and we will use NATO forces to do that. So you better not use a tactical nuclear weapon, or you're going to end up on the wrong side of the stick. And simultaneously, we are offering you this carrot. Here's an off-ramp. You get to keep certain parts of the Donbass region. You get to keep Crimea, and that's the off-ramp. You need a carrot and you need a stick. The problem is that Joe Biden is not making clear exactly what the carrot is or what the stick is. All that he's making clear is that he takes Vladimir Putin incredibly seriously, which means that Vladimir Putin now has the miscalculation of thinking that he has Biden over a barrel because of his threats to use nuclear weapons. And meanwhile, the Biden administration is being excessively unclear about what it actually means, what are its limits in Ukraine. So if you really fear nuclear war, then are you really willing to arm the Ukrainians with significant forward weaponry? Like, how far are you willing to go? Again, you could be willing to do both, but you have to make that clear. You can say to the Russians, listen, your best off-ramp is now. And your best off-ramp is now because we are about to give significant offensive weaponry to the Ukrainians so they can be on the move in places like Crimea and the Donbass region. And all the rest of what I just said, right? If you use nuclear weapons, we're going to take out pretty much all your forces in Ukraine. We have air superiority. And by the way, here's an off-ramp. But he's not doing any of these things. Like the complete miasmatic approach to policy here, the lack of clarity with regard to policy. And then, if you're going to be completely miasmatic, then I have to assume from the outside that maybe there are negotiations going on behind the scenes. But when you go out and you say this stuff publicly in front of Democratic donors, what you're doing is you are skewing the. This happens all the time. Okay, you want to know how we got war in Ukraine? It was through strategic ambiguity in which the president of the United States made very unclear what the United States would do in case of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin called what he thought was the West bluff. And it turns out the West was not bluffing, at least economically speaking, and in terms of material aid to Ukraine. And this is frequently how wars get started. I've made this point over and over and over before. When you're talking about the original Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, there's a lot of suggestion that there was an American diplomat named April Gillespie who, in negotiations with the Iraqis, basically said, listen, if you guys go into Kuwait, it's going to be hands off. Now, she denies that's the case. There's a lot of questions about what she actually said, what she didn't say. But clearly, Iraq thought that they weren't going to get the response from the West that they got when they went into Kuwait. When World War I broke out, pretty much everybody thought that that was going to be an incredibly short war with small territorial gains made, and then everybody goes back to status quo ante. That's not what happened. Miscalculation is very often what leads to war. Alrighty, folks, we've reached the end of today's show. However, if you are a subscriber, there's much, much more coming up, including Kanye explaining that he is actually pro-life. Plus, we'll get to a brand new documentary coming out from Candace Owens. You're not going to want to miss it. If you're not a member, click the link in the description and join us.